Hello, everyone. My name's Pearson, and here with me is Daryl, Becky, and Trent. Together, we make up Team Artemis, and today we'll be discussing the concept of globalization and social justice. Now, this is not the globalization of social justice, but rather we're examining how the concept of businesses and organizations developing a more international influence through several means may expand, hinder, or otherwise affect social justice. Globalization can have several definitions and can be accomplished in many different ways. But the World Economic Forum explains globalization essentially as the integration of markets and investments in such a way that different nations can trade products and services more efficiently globally. So, social justice, on the other hand, can be a little bit more difficult to define, as many will view it and what it stands for differently. I don't think we need to dive too deeply into defining social justice here, but we can essentially break it down to simply being about improving people's lives overall. Today, we're going to have a look at globalization and how it has improved or not improved people's lives in three very different examples. We'll be looking at its effects in a very wealthy, developed country, Canada, that Daryl will walk us through, a much less wealthy and developing country, Nicaragua, with Becky, and a third example that we felt as more or less in the middle, which is South Africa, that Trent will talk to us about. For the sake of not boring everyone with a 2 hour long presentation, we'll be focusing on three key areas where concepts of social justice may be affected by globalization, education, women's rights, and non-governmental organizations, or we refer to them as NGOs later. So, Daryl, what are some social justice-based problems that we may encounter in Canada?
Thanks, Pearson. So looking at Canada and at the three topics that we selected, education, NGOs, and women's rights. So NGOs in Canada function interestingly in that most are not here doing a work in Canada. The exception to that is environmental NGOs, which there are 31. Greenpeace probably being the most common, popular, noteworthy in Canada. And however, as we won't touch on environmental as that's next week's topic for the next team. So we'll move past that quickly to say human rights NGOs in Canada, there's 9 of them operating. They generally operate here in Canada to fundraise, and most of those funds are directed elsewhere. There's an interesting conflict here in Canada with fundraising and foreign policy and NGOs, in that often the Canadian government is funding some of these NGOs, and they often or occasionally have running conflict with the Canada's foreign policy goals. So funding an NGO, for example, may contradict what the foreign policy goal of the Canadian government is. That ties to the education topic. And CETA, which is the Canadian International Development Agency, runs the Development Education and Amateur Program, or DEEP, which provides educational information about low-income countries and promotes the contribution of Canadian aid overseas. However, some of the NGOs that received some of that funding became critical of the Canadian aid, how it was directed, and how it was being used, and some of the negatives that Trent will touch on about how development and globalization can have a negative impact. And so the funding to those organizations from CETA was cut. And so there's the push and pull of positive Globalization Canada funding some positive activities. However, when those activities run afoul of the Canadian government, the funding can end up being pulled. And then finally, just to touch quickly on women's rights here in Canada and some of the factors of globalization, there's been a push and Canada now has an international feminist policy released by the Canadian government in 2021. There was calls in 2017 to apply a gender lens across all of the NAFTA agreements, all of the international trade agreements. And women have been impacted in both positive and negative ways with globalization from within Canada. There's been a loss of some labor certainty, more precarious job labor situations. However, social programs have been reinforced in Canada because of globalization. So it's like we'll hear throughout the presentation, bit of a push and pull on both sides in terms of what globalization has caused.
Thanks, Daryl. Yeah, certainly two sides to the coin there for Canada. There's definitely a major push and pull, some pros and cons in Canada. Now, over to Trent, a very different perspective now in South Africa. What are some of the social justice-based problems that you've found in some of your research in impacting South Africans?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pearson. I found that the main issues facing South Africa are poverty, lack of education, and unemployment. There's other issues persisting, such as just inequality between blacks and whites in the country, as well as a poor healthcare system. I won't delve too deep into those, but poverty in South Africa is multi-layered. One can say that opportunities and socioeconomic status can be determined a lot based on race, gender, and physical location. For example, 8 out of 10 people who live in rural areas of South Africa are poor, and that's over twice the amount compared to those living in urban areas. One thing that's key in attaining these opportunities is education, but sadly, 78.5% of people who do not have education are poor, and that kind of just goes to show that. This issue is also exacerbated with women as they are disproportionately affected by the HIV crisis in South Africa and also have to leave school for early pregnancy or health-related issues. There's upwards of 80% fewer women in primary education than men. So in summary, I would say the main social justice issues facing South Africa are poverty, gender inequality, and lack of quality education.
Right. Those are some pretty serious implications flowing from that. Lack of equality, gender equality, and good education, all some pretty serious points there. So, what are some of the ways that you found that globalization may have impacted some of these social justice issues in South Africa?
I'm going to say the main thing is just increased awareness on an international level. NGOs such as the UN have conducted studies that have revealed issues within the education system as well as issues faced by women. Such international awareness has sparked a lot of humanitarian movements in the country. One organization I looked at specifically was MIET Africa, and they've partnered with agencies such as the United States Agency for International Development, as well as the Royal Netherlands Embassy, launching programs that seek to improve education, keep girls in school and in clean health. Likewise, they've sought to bring further international attention to the issues faced by Africa by forging partnerships with other global education leaders. Yeah, so in a sense, they've launched programs trying to further education, keep women in school, and hopefully by improving that, we'll see less inequality. And with the better education should correlate with more opportunities and employment within the country. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that without globalization, Africa probably wouldn't see as much outside help. I think the outside help is a good thing, but I have to look back in my research and see that there's also been some domestic attempts to solve some of these persisting social justice issues, and they haven't really been met with a whole lot of success. Whether it's just consistent lack of effort or the fact these issues and inequality are just so deeply entrenched in the culture in South Africa. Overall, there's been very little domestic success in solving these wicked problems. I wonder that if there was less emphasis on outside help, if there'd maybe be a little bit more motivation within the country to solve their own issues. I personally think that solid policy on a domestic level would correlate with greater long-term success than all these agencies coming in and just helping with bits and pieces.
That's a good point. A bit of a double-edged sword there with the NGOs coming in from abroad and reducing some of the focus on some of the domestic steps taken there. So that's a good point. Thank you, Trent. To wrap things up, I'm going to speak with Becky now, who is going to discuss some of the social justice-based issues she's found in a much different country from Canada and South Africa, which is Nicaragua, a far poorer and developing country from some of the others we've discussed. So, Becky, what are some of the social justice-based problems that you've encountered in your research with Nicaragua?
Yeah, thanks, Pearson. As Trent said, a lot of the problems come from poverty, lack of access to education, healthcare, clean water. It's a very poor country, and the poverty rates have actually been declining since the early 2000s. But then in the last few years, the government, which is quite an authoritarian government, now that poverty rate is stalling and income equality rates are again on the rise in the country. It has a very high income inequality, and there's been a big crackdown on the NGOs lately, and over 440 of them have been closed since 2018. And again, that's the government that has just decided that they are not going to have outside NGOs working in the country. A lot of the ones that promote human rights, education, women's rights. Nicaragua is an interesting country for women's rights in that it is one of the countries that has gone backwards on their abortion rights. In 2006, they implemented a total ban on abortions in the country, in all cases, no exceptions. Women and girls who terminate their pregnancies can face sentences up to 2 years in prison, and medical professionals can be sentenced up to 6 years for providing abortions. And so there's a bit of a different way that the NGOs are losing ground in the country, and it's having an impact on the people in a negative way.
Wow. So, in your opinion, the government's recent steps away from globalization in Nicaragua are really having a negative effect on the lives and people that are living there?
Yeah, they really are, because these are the organizations that are going in and fighting for clean water, protection of women, the defense of human rights, environmental protections, and all of those are being limited now.
Well, there's some very vast differences there to how globalization has affected these three different countries, and the social justice issues that exist in all of them are all very different. And we've seen that globalization can impact them in different ways, whether it be awareness in South Africa or the steps away from globalization that we've seen in Nicaragua. So thank you for watching our presentation. We're Team Artemis, and please see our questions in our forum to discuss the matter further.